One night in March of 2016, two friends sat on a couch in Lunel, France, watching a true crime show on TV. And the episode really hit close to home, literally, because it was about a missing person who had vanished just miles away from where they lived. And so they're watching this show, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of it, one of the friends suddenly stood up and began pacing around the room, muttering to themselves. And when the other friend, who was still sitting on the couch watching this, asked them what was wrong, they were not ready for the answer. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At 4:30 p.m. on June 23, 2014, 49-year-old Patrick Issoire hurried out the side door of a hospital in Sète, France, buttoning a fresh collared shirt as he ran to the parking lot. He climbed onto a scooter and then quickly checked his watch, and then he lifted the kickstand and sped off into traffic, ignoring honks from all the other drivers as he swerved between the cars. Patrick did not care who he was annoying right now, because he was running late for a date, and then right after the date, he had to rush over to his daughter's dance recital. And he desperately wanted to make sure he made both of these events, because they were some of the only things he'd had to look forward to in ages. So things in Patrick's life had not been good for a really long time. 8 years earlier, he had slipped into a rut of serious binge drinking and gambling. And one day, when he was drunk, he had actually struck his wife. Following that, his wife had divorced him, and he'd lost custody of his daughter, Alabama, who was now 12 years old. After that, Patrick's life really did not get any better. He had moved in with his elderly mother, and his drinking had only gotten worse, and his gambling continued to the point where he basically gambled away most of what he made by working as a hospital janitor. And then after that, he'd gotten involved with a married coworker, and then when her husband found out about this affair, she died of an apparent suicide. Her death had been 5 years earlier, and it had been so traumatic that Patrick had barely dated since. He had just about resigned himself to a life of bachelorhood, when actually a few weeks earlier, he had gotten a call from the woman he was now going to meet, Audrey Levay. But Patrick was now running so late for his date that he worried Audrey might not wait around for him. So he twisted the throttle of his scooter and shot across an intersection, ignoring more honks from more cars. Patrick had actually met Audrey a long time ago, right after his divorce, and they'd gone out a handful of times before they ultimately lost touch. She was a lot younger than he was, and she'd stood him up more than once in the past. But she was also a lot of fun, and it had been a while since Patrick had been on a date, so when she called him up saying she wanted to go out again, Patrick had said, sure. They'd made plans to meet this afternoon at a park near Patrick's work that had this big rocky hill rising behind it. And the place had some of the best views in the whole city, with the ocean on one side and dramatic cliffs dotted with all these old caves on the other. Now, they were not going to have a whole lot of time together, probably just enough for a short walk before Patrick would have to rush off for his daughter's dance recital later that night. But he hoped that the romantic setting might help spark something between them again. A few minutes later, Patrick pulled up to the park entrance, and to his relief, Audrey was still there waiting for him. So he parked his scooter and locked his cell phone in the scooter's underseat compartment, and he walked over to her. And from her nervous smile, he got the sense that she was almost as excited about the date as he was, which gave him a nice boost of confidence. So he took her hand, and they started down the path. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, 10 miles up the coastline from where Patrick and Audrey had been walking at that park, Patrick's older brother, Mark Issoire, stood on the deck of his boat, pulling a big oyster trap out of the water. As he was doing this, his phone rang, so he stopped and he answered it. But before he could even say hello, his mother's very worried voice came across the line, asking if he knew where Patrick was. Mark frowned, because Patrick lived with their mother, so she should know better than he would. But his mother explained that Patrick hadn't come home last night. He also wasn't answering his phone, he hadn't shown up to work that morning, and perhaps most concerning of all, he'd missed his daughter's dance recital the previous evening. And it was this last fact that made Mark think that something might actually be wrong here, because he knew how much Patrick loved his daughter and how much he was looking forward to that recital. So he promised his mother he would get to the bottom of it, then he hung up and began calling Patrick's friends. However, with each conversation he had, Mark got more worried, because nobody had heard from Patrick since yesterday afternoon. He'd apparently left work around 4 p.m., but he hadn't told anybody where he was going. Now for Mark, he felt like this was at least somewhere to start. Patrick's work. So he steered his boat to the dock, tied it off, and then jumped in his car and started heading that direction. 4 hours later, Mark stood on a rocky lookout point scanning the city below. Patrique's hospital stood in the middle of Set's business district, which was packed with canals and cafes and tourist spots, and Mark and a handful of Patrique's friends had spent all morning checking them one by one, looking for Patrique. But they hadn't found him or any sign of him. And so now Mark had turned his focus to some of the more remote areas around the city, like the hill behind the park where he now stood. But there was still no sign of Patrique anywhere. And so Mark was trying to think of anywhere else his brother might have gone when his phone rang. It was one of Patrique's friends from the search party, and he just found Patrique's scooter outside the park at the bottom of the hill, just a short drive from where Mark was. And so Mark told him not to touch anything, and he sprinted back to his car, and he sped down the hill, and he left the park, and he stopped in the parking lot right outside. And sure enough, there in the lot was Patrique's scooter. And as Mark looked at the scooter and at the quiet park all around him, he felt a cold weight settle in his stomach, because he really couldn't think of any reason why Patrique would leave his scooter here overnight. In the back of his mind all day, Mark had been worried that something bad could have happened to his little brother. But now, after seeing this scooter, he felt sure of it. Almost 2 weeks later, at 8 a.m. on July 5th, 2014, Detective Boris Ferrier took the exit ramp toward the French town of Set. And as the sunlight hit his windshield, he had to squint as he looked out at the long stretch of beaches and canals framed by these beautiful rocky cliffs in a small, dense urban center. Verrier was a senior investigator from the nearby city of Montpellier, but he had just been called in to take over a missing persons case that had stumped the local police in Set. About 2 weeks earlier, 49-year-old Patrique Isouard had disappeared after going on a date with a woman whose name was Audrey Louvet. The local police had already spoken to Audrey, who said she didn't know what had happened to Patrique. She said they had gone for a walk, and then he had escorted her to her bus, and then after that, she'd assumed that Patrique just sort of went back to his scooter and carried on with his night. But the scooter had been found the next day, still parked, where he and Audrey had met up for their date, with no sign of Patrique anywhere nearby. And now, almost 2 weeks later, Patrique had still not turned up. Since then, Patrique's brother, Mark, had been helping the investigation. Verrier had spoken to Mark on the phone, and Mark had talked about Patrique like he was a saint, a guy who would drop everything to help out somebody in a jam, who never got into fights and had really no enemies. But Verrier didn't necessarily believe this, because in his experience, people who inexplicably vanished oftentimes were kidnapped or murdered. Now, he had no reason to actually suspect that around Patrique. He could have just as easily gotten into an accident, fallen off a cliff, or maybe he chose to vanish. But at this point, what Verrier really needed to do was, on his own, dig into who Patrique was and figure out if there was a reason why he wasn't here right now. Do you want a treat that's both refreshing and indulgent? Well, My Mochi ice cream is creamy, premium ice cream wrapped in sweet, chewy dough that is absolutely satisfying and joyfully chill. My Mochi comes in delicious flavors like strawberry, mango, and cookies and cream. The strawberry is made with real fruit and tastes like biting into the perfect strawberry at peak summer. It's the perfect balance of chewy and creamy and fruity and cozy. But my favorite flavor is for sure cookies and cream. It's dreamy, creamy, and the cookie bits keep it fun. I take them out of the freezer and I let them soften up just a little bit, and then I can't stop eating them. My Mochi is also gluten-free and only around 70 calories per piece. It comes in a box with 6 individual snacks, which makes it really easy to share. That is, if you want to. Look for the purple box of My Mochi ice cream in the freezer aisle of your local grocery store. A few minutes later, Verrier followed Patrique's ex-wife, whose name was Claude Ozize, into her living room, and they both sat down. Verrier switched on his recording device, and he asked Claude where she was on the day Patrique went missing. Claude said it was just an ordinary Monday for her, and that after work she had picked up their daughter, Alabama, from school and driven her to her dance recital. She had expected to meet Patrique there at the recital, and it really surprised her when he didn't show up, because even though Patrique had plenty of flaws, he was a good dad. And at that, Verrier sort of leaned forward, because Patrique's flaws were actually what he wanted to know about. Now, he didn't think Claude was guilty of anything here, since she had a pretty strong alibi and didn't really stand to benefit from Patrique's disappearance. But he hoped she could maybe tell him about any old habits or current habits that could have gotten Patrique into trouble. And so when he asked her about this, Claude hesitated before saying she really didn't want to badmouth Patrique. But he drank and gambled a lot more than he should. At this point, Verrier pressed her for more details, but Claude just insisted that Patrique had really always kept that part of his life away from her. But after she thought about it for a moment, she said there was someone who might be able to tell Verrier more. And then she called their 12-year-old daughter, Alabama, into the room. Alabama appeared very visibly nervous and shaken up by everything going on with her dad, but her mother, Claude, took her hand and encouraged her to share her story. And slowly, the girl began to speak. She said that about a week before her dad disappeared, he'd brought her along on a very strange errand. They'd parked outside of a tunnel, and he'd told her to wait in the car. And then he got out and walked into this tunnel to meet with someone. It was a man. But it was too dark in the tunnel for Alabama to make out the man's features, but she definitely saw her father, Patrique, hand this man some kind of package before he quickly turned and ran back to the car. And then afterwards, her father wouldn't tell her who this man was. He just said that he'd done something really stupid, and because of it, he now owed some people a lot of money. After Alabama finished talking, her mother, Claude, thanked her and sent her back out of the room. And then once she was gone, Verrier asked Claude if she knew who this man in the tunnel might be. But Claude said she had no idea. But she said she did have one name that was worth looking into. Now, this was not someone who would have lent Patrique any money, but instead, it was a man who held a personal grudge against him. His name was Remy Chen, and he was a local hairstylist. An hour later, Verrier sat in a cramped cubicle of the Sète police station, scrolling through a file on his laptop. Based on Claude's tip, he'd looked up the hairstylist's name in the police database and had immediately found a connection to Patrique. Back in 2009, so a few years after Patrique's divorce, Patrique had been questioned as a witness in the suicide of Remy Chen's wife, a woman named Nadège Chen, who had worked with Patrique at the hospital. Apparently, Nadège had come home after a work party and confessed to Remy that she'd been having this affair with Patrique. The couple argued for hours about it, and Nadège ended up sleeping on the couch while Remy went upstairs to their bedroom. And then the next day, Remy found Nadège in their garage, hanging by the neck. As soon as Verrier was done reading this, he knew he finally had a suspect, and so he looked up Remy's last known address and contact information. At around 10 a.m. the next day, so July 7th, Verrier followed Remy Chen into an interrogation room at the Sète police station and shut the door behind them. Remy was a short, wiry man with a very obvious scowl on his face that made it clear he thought he was being very inconvenienced here. Verrier immediately got the feeling that Remy would likely only crack under intense pressure. So, right away, he tried to shake Remy by saying they knew he was involved in the kidnapping of Patrique Isouard. Now, this was a total bluff, because Verrier did not actually have any evidence, but he wanted to see how Remy would react. And to his surprise and irritation, Remy just laughed. Remy acted like he literally had no idea who Verrier was even talking about. And when Verrier brought up his late wife and sort of insinuated that obviously Patrique had had an affair and was a witness when she had died, Remy just scoffed and reminded him that it had been 5 years since her passing. He said he had moved on and begun dating other people. And anyways, it was sort of absurd to think that he would hold a grudge for 5 years without doing anything, but then suddenly now decide to take some sort of revenge out of the blue. It just didn't add up. But Verrier didn't really know what to make of this. It seemed like Remy was really confident, almost too confident. And so he pivoted and just asked Remy where he was on June 23rd, the day Patrique went missing. And after thinking for a moment, Remy just said that he had spent the whole afternoon alone cleaning out a storage unit that he had rented. This was obviously not a great alibi at all, but at this point Verrier had no choice but to let Remy go. As Verrier watched Remy leave, he knew he was running out of time here. 2 weeks had already passed since Patrique's disappearance, and every day the odds of finding him alive got worse. So out of desperation, Verrier decided to circle back to the very start and speak again to Audrey Louvet. Being the last person to see Patrique before he went missing, Audrey was an obvious person of interest, but Verrier wasn't sure what more he could learn from her. The local police had already questioned her at the very beginning of the investigation, and Verrier had already watched that interview tape a number of times. But Verrier knew he just had to take a shot, so he picked up the phone and he called Audrey into the station. Later that same afternoon, around 2 p.m., Verrier sat across from Audrey in the same room where he just interviewed Remy. He said hello to her and he started the recorder, and then he asked her to explain her history with Patrick again. And at first, her answers were all just like they'd been on the tape. She said they had met 8 years ago in 2006, and they'd dated casually for a while before losing contact. And then, just a few weeks ago, she happened to pass the bar where they first met, and it made her think of Patrick. So she'd called him up out of the blue to ask how he was doing, and they'd ultimately made plans to see each other again. She described their date as being a short walk around the park, after which Patrick had walked her to the bus stop and then headed off, presumably to go back to his scooter and to head off to his daughter's dance recital. And that's when Verrier interrupted, and he asked Audrey to tell him specifically which direction Patrick had headed off after dropping her off at the bus stop. And Audrey sat there for a minute, and then she said, I can't remember. And this really bothered Verrier, because here was this person who should be able to tell him the most about Patrick's last moves, and she had basically nothing useful to offer the investigation. So Verrier just sort of dropped the polite tone and really went after her. He told her he wasn't buying her act, and that she needed to tell him everything she knew right now, or this was all going to get much, much worse for her. Audrey's eyes went wide and her voice began to shake as she insisted that she'd already told them everything. But Verrier didn't let up. He kept demanding that she just admit what she'd done until he was practically shouting at her. And Audrey was in tears and she was repeating over and over that Patrick had been fine when she left him. She just didn't remember all the details. And finally, Verrier backed off. He'd run countless interrogations throughout his career, and his gut was starting to tell him that Audrey's fragility was not really an act here. He'd pushed her as hard as he could, and he had to admit that maybe she was just telling the truth. A little while later, after Audrey was gone, Verrier sat alone inside the interrogation room thinking about the case. He hadn't managed to rule out any suspects yet, and he still had no idea who that mysterious man in the tunnel might be. And on top of all that, there was still the possibility that no crime had been committed here, since they had no body. I mean, who knows what really happened to Patrick at this point? And Verrier knew that there were just too many unknowns. And Verrier knew that if the case was ever going to gain real traction, they needed to find Patrick, dead or alive. Around 11 a.m. on July 17th, so 3.5 weeks after Patrick Isouard disappeared, Detective Boris Verrier parked along the shoulder of a winding roadside in the French town of Sète. He got out of his car, he stooped beneath a strip of yellow police tape, and he headed across the long strip of dry grass leading up to a sheer cliff wall. A dozen yards ahead of him, barely visible in the rock face, was the dark, round opening of a cave. A few hours earlier, a group of teenagers had shown up at the police station seeming very frazzled, saying they had found a human body inside of that cave. And as soon as Verrier had heard about this, he had rushed to the scene because the cave was less than a half a mile away from where Patrick's scooter had been abandoned. And so now Verrier turned on his flashlight and he stepped into the cave. And as soon as he did, a forensics team fell into step right behind him, and together they began making their way into the darkness. Thanks to his flashlight, Verrier could see that the walls were covered in graffiti and that there were empty bottles and other garbage everywhere. So it seemed like this was probably a popular party spot for young people. As they moved deeper, the cave split off into a maze of all these different narrow tunnels. And just as Verrier was about to direct his team to spread out and begin searching all of them, he passed by one of these tunnels that absolutely reeked. And so Verrier stopped what he was doing and just aimed his flashlight down this particular tunnel. And he saw there was a shallow pit dug into the floor. And lying at the bottom of this pit was what looked like a ragged lump of black fabric, until Verrier stepped closer. The smell was overpowering now, and Verrier knew he was standing over the charred remains of a human body. Verrier bent down to examine it, and he saw right away there was what appeared to be a bullet hole in the skull and a bullet hole to the torso. And those details, one to the head, one to the stomach, and then, the body being burnt afterwards, likely to get rid of evidence, felt very familiar to Verrier. It felt like this could have been a mob hit. A year and a half later, so just before Christmas of 2015, Detective Verrier was in his office in Montpellier when his phone rang. It was Patrick's older brother, Mark, calling to ask for updates on his brother's case, again. And Verrier sighed because the truth was, he had nothing new to report. The body in the cave had been confirmed to be Patrick, and so Verrier had hoped that that discovery would lead to all these new leads. But after scouring the cave for clues and testing the cigarettes from the scene for DNA and speaking to the teenagers who reported the body, the case just hit a dead end. Now, the mob-like execution style did line up with a theory that Verrier had that, maybe Patrick had been killed over a gambling debt, by the mob basically, or someone who was affiliated with, organized crime. But Verrier had never been able to actually uncover any trace of Patrick having any sort of debt that would get him killed. Also, he still had not been able to identify that mysterious man in the tunnel that Patrick's daughter had mentioned. And so that left Remy and also Audrey as his only suspects. And Verrier had placed both of them under surveillance, but so far, neither of them had done anything suspicious. So the investigation was now stuck, and Verrier understood that Patrick's family was really out of patience here. So he was not surprised that when he admitted he still was not ready to make an arrest, Mark snapped. He told Verrier that if the police weren't capable of solving this, he was going to take matters into his own hands. 3 months later, on a night in March of 2016, Detective Verrier sat down on his couch in his living room to watch something that he'd been warned was coming. Mark had convinced the producers of a national true crime TV show to do an episode on his brother's case, and the episode was airing tonight. And as the show started, Verrier felt a knot of anxiety, because Mark knew details about the investigation that were not meant for the public, and if he shared them on this show, it could seriously compromise the case. But obviously, Verrier was also just curious to see how the episode had turned out, and part of him hoped that maybe renewed public attention might actually help the case. And as Verrier watched the show, he was relieved to see that Mark wasn't there to talk about case specifics. He was there to talk about Patrick. Mark described his brother as this hardworking father who never seemed to catch a break in life, and who at the very least deserved justice. And at the end, he put out a simple plea for anyone with information to please come forward. When the show ended, Verrier did not really feel worried anymore that anything that had been revealed on the show was sensitive or that it could negatively impact the actual investigation. But he also knew that, the impact the show was going to have was probably going to be pretty small. Like, he didn't expect anything to come of this plea for help from the public. However, he would be wrong, because the next morning, Verrier's phone would ring. And an hour after that call came in, Verrier was ringing the doorbell of an apartment building in Lunel, which is a town close to Sète. A woman would answer the door, and when Verrier flashed his badge, she invited him inside. The woman, whose name was Sophie, had reached out to the police after watching Mark's interview on TV, saying she did have information about Patrick's case. And so Verrier followed her into her kitchen, and he sat down across the table from her, and he turned on his recorder, and he told her to just start from the beginning. And the moment the story began to spill out, Verrier knew he'd solved the case. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and witness testimony, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Patrick Isouard on the afternoon of Monday, June 23, 2014. At 4:30 p.m., the killer stood on a rocky hill overlooking a park in Sète, watching through a pair of binoculars while Patrick and Audrey walked hand in hand down a paved path below. The couple was taking their time, clearly enjoying the scenery and each other's company, and then at some point, Audrey stopped and pointed across the road at a cave in the nearby cliffs, the entrance to a cave. And when the killer saw this, their heart began to race, and they watched intently as the couple actually crossed the road and went into the cave and vanished. At this point, the killer lowered their binoculars and put them inside of the large duffel bag they had brought with them. Then, after slinging this bag, they hustled down the hill and went right to the entrance of the cave. When they reached the entrance to the cave, they stopped, and they put that bag on the ground. They unzipped it, and out of it they pulled a large rifle, a roll of duct tape, and also a white mask. The killer put the mask on, and with the rifle and tape in hand, they entered the cave. and they could hear the sound of Patrick and Audrey inside. They had not gone far, and they clearly had not clocked the killer coming in. They were sort of wrapped up in their date. However, when the killer got close enough, the couple heard their footsteps, and they turned around. When Audrey saw the killer in their mask with the gun, she began to scream, and Patrick, he just went white as a ghost. Before the couple could even react, the killer threw the duct tape at Audrey and told her that if she wanted to live, she would do exactly as instructed. Then the killer told Audrey to use this tape and bind Patrick's wrists and ankles. And at first, Audrey just stood there in stunned silence, but eventually she composed herself and she obeyed. And as she was binding Patrick just also stood there in stunned silence, not really sure what to even do. When Audrey was done, the killer told her to leave the cave and to not say anything about what had happened here. She hesitated just long enough to glance back at Patrick, but then she turned and she ran. Once her footsteps had faded and it was just the killer and Patrick inside of this cave, Patrick just stared, wondering what was going to happen to him, and the killer, after making really intense eye contact with Patrick, raised his rifle and shot Patrick in the head and also once in the chest, and Patrick crumpled to the ground. At that point, the killer slung his rifle, and then he grabbed Patrick by the ankles and he dragged his body down a nearby tunnel and dumped him in that shallow pit. Then the killer doused the body with lighter fluid from a canister they'd brought in that bag. They lit a match and tossed it in. As Patrick's body began to burn, the killer walked out of the cave and pulled off their mask as soon as they stepped into the light. They now had only one thing left to do: go find Audrey and explain everything, and convince her not to go to the police. Because the killer was Remy Shen, the hairstylist who hated Patrick for having an affair with his late wife, and he had just successfully tricked Audrey into helping him pull this murder off. It would turn out Audrey was actually Remy's ex-girlfriend. They had met and begun dating in 2009, shortly after the death of Remy's wife. And Remy had realized that because of Audrey's history with Patrick, because they had also dated, he could use her to lure Patrick into a trap and finally take his revenge. But even though Audrey was clearly a key part of this plan, she didn't actually know that Remy was going to kill Patrick. Remy had told her a sob story about Patrick owing him a lot of money, and she thought they were just going to scare him into paying up. It was not until she got into the cave and Remy showed up with a mask on and a rifle that she realized he had something way more sinister in his mind. After the murder, Remy convinced Audrey to stay silent by threatening to kill her and her children. And for over a year, she kept his secret, lying to the police the whole time. But when she watched that true crime episode about the case and saw Mark's plea for information, she finally just cracked and confessed to her friend Sophie, who was watching the show with her, who then went on to call the police the very next day. On March 31st, 2016, Remy Shen and Audrey Louvet were arrested for their roles in Patrick's death. Remy received 30 years in prison for murder, and Audrey was sentenced to 12 years for acting as an accessory to the kidnapping. On the afternoon of Saturday, February 6th, 2010, 61-year-old Alan Lelu set up the ironing board behind the couch in the living room of a little house outside the town of Chartres in northern France. From the kitchen, he could smell the beef bourguignon simmering on the stove, but Alan and the 37-year-old woman who was cooking the beef bourguignon were not talking. The woman's name was Alexandra Nicola, and Alan had actually bought this house for her and her 10-year-old daughter. Alexandra used to be Alan's assistant, but over the years, they had developed a really close relationship that was much more like father to daughter. Now, Alexandra had not worked for Alan in a number of years, but, they remained close. And also, remember, Alan literally bought her this house. And so as a result of this bond they had, Alan found himself visiting her quite a bit at this house, helping out where he could. And he also paid for her car and also for their vacations. And Alan could afford to be this generous because he was a very successful, high-powered producer of circus shows, which were a huge moneymaker in France. Lots of companies booked circus shows for end-of-the-year parties for their employees, and Alan had lots of major contracts. And so as a result, Alan's office was in this fancy chateau in the countryside, and his wife actually lived in this luxury ski town near the Swiss border, and Alan was constantly traveling all over Europe for work. But this life could also be a grind. Just in the past 24 hours, Alan had traveled more than 1,200 miles, meeting with potential clients and scouting new performers. So he put a lot of value on the time where he could escape to Alexandra's house, where he could recharge in the quiet of the suburbs, and obviously spend time with somebody he cared a lot about. Now, Alan knew all of his friends and coworkers thought that he and Alexandra were blatantly having an affair here, and he was sure that's what his own wife assumed too. And this was fair, because after all, Alan did have lots of extramarital relationships. He also engaged with sex workers all the time, and he really didn't even try to hide any of it. He and his wife, Elizabeth, they lived in separate homes, and they sort of had this understanding that she can have this life, and he can have this life in exchange. However, Alan's relationship with Alexandra really was different. It had always been platonic. They'd never even kissed or held hands. Alan had no kids of his own, and he genuinely enjoyed playing the role of, doting father and grandfather to Alexandra and her daughter respectively. But now they were in this big fight, and Alan was anxious to repair it. Alexandra's daughter was out of the house for the weekend, so he and Alexandra had planned to have this nice dinner tonight before Alan had to head out again on business on Sunday afternoon. But Alan, somewhat stupidly, had brought up Alexandra's past, and they'd ended up getting into this horrible fight and just continued to yell at each other ever since. Alexandra was very defensive about her troubled history. When she was a young woman, she had moved to Paris and she had fallen in love and she had had a baby, but the baby had tragically died, and her relationship with her love had fallen apart, and so she had spiraled into very self-destructive behavior. By the time Alan finally met her in 2002, so this is 8 years before they were in this house having this big fight, Alexandra was really struggling. By this point, she had a 2-year-old daughter, and she was really struggling to provide for her because all she could muster in terms of work was like this combination of minimum wage jobs and side hustles. And so when Alan had hired her as his, full-time secretary, it had completely transformed her life. But, deep down, sometimes she seemed more resentful of Alan's power than grateful for his help. It's like he had total control over her well-being, and she didn't necessarily like that. And so with that as context, Alan left the ironing board and walked into the kitchen, hoping that Alexandra had cooled down enough that they could actually have a real conversation here. And so once he was in the kitchen, he sort of looked over at Alexandra and couldn't really tell where she was at, and then he turned, opened up the fridge, and just kind of stared inside of it, not really looking for any food or drink or anything. He was just hoping that Alexandra would say something to him. And to his relief, Alexandra did turn around and kind of playfully swung her dish towel at him, telling him that he had to wait for dinner. She didn't seem mad at him anymore, so Alan felt very relieved, and he smiled and closed the fridge, and then he told her to come sit with him and have some wine while they waited for the laundry to dry so she could iron it. A few minutes later, they both sat down on the sofa with their wine glasses, and Alexandra asked Alan how business was going. He told her it was good, which technically it was. His company was on track to bring in around 4 million euros that year, which is the equivalent of about 5 million US dollars. But despite how things looked on paper, Alan was pretty stressed. He made the majority of his money through contracts with companies, but he was not the only person competing for those lucrative contracts. His number one competitor was another circus owner whose name was Michel de la Rue. And recently, Michel had been beating Alan on one contract after another. And it was starting to feel to Alan like Michel was actually targeting Alan's contracts, trying to steal them from him, rather than trying to cultivate his own clients. Alan told Alexandra that on Monday, he had a very important meeting in Vichy, which is a city in central France about a 4-hour drive south of Alexandra's house. At this meeting, Alan was hoping to win a big contract, as long as Michel didn't steal it out from under him. Alexandra put her hand on Alan's arm and told him, "Don't worry." She said she was sure his meeting on Monday would be a huge success and they could celebrate in a few weeks on the ski trip that he had booked for the two of them and her daughter. Then she put down her now empty wine glass and went to go do the laundry. As Alexandra disappeared into the back of the house, Alan just kind of sat by himself for a minute. He was looking forward to the vacation that she had mentioned. in part because Alexandra had been a lot busier lately with her new boyfriend, a 42-year-old IT engineer from Paris named Yves Bernard. Now, Alan and Eve got along just fine, but he could tell that, Alexandra and Eve were getting pretty serious. They might even get married. And Alan couldn't help but worry that eventually, if that happened, Eve might start to resent him for sort of stepping in as this paternal figure in Alexandra's life, that perhaps he would come off as being sort of overbearing. But he was not going to let that fear wreck the evening. So as Alexandra came back now with the laundry, picked up a book from the coffee table, and took the last sip of his wine. The rest of the weekend passed by quickly, and by Sunday afternoon, Alan was back in his car, headed back out of town. But what no one would realize until much later was there was actually a second car following closely behind him. The following day, on the morning of Monday, February 8th, Alan Lilu's wife, Elizabeth, was drinking a coffee inside her home in the mountains when her phone rang. She picked it up, and she heard the voice of Alan's assistant, Sylvie. And Sylvie sounded very worried, and she said she was calling to see if Elizabeth had heard from her husband recently. And this was pretty strange, because Alan was not the type of person to just disappear from work without telling his secretary. So Elizabeth told Sylvie that no, she hadn't heard from Alan in a few days. And then she asked Sylvie, why? What's going on here? And as Elizabeth listened to Sylvie's answer, she felt herself growing really nervous. Because apparently, Alan had this very important meeting in Vichy that morning, but he had not shown up for it. In fact, he'd never even checked into the hotel in Vichy where he was supposed to be staying. Sylvie said she had already reached out to several of Alan's friends and business contacts, but nobody had heard from him. And he was not answering the repeated phone calls to both of his cell phones, which appeared to be turned off. None of this made any sense to Elizabeth. Alan was famous for spending entire days on his various phones. She couldn't even recall a time when he'd been unreachable, even briefly. So Elizabeth told Sylvie she was glad she called, but she would take it from here. Then Elizabeth hung up the phone with Sylvie and called the police. Hey guys, I have some pretty big news. I know many of you are excited to hear. I am going to be doing another live storytelling tour this year. You can find me in a bunch of cities, including new ones on the West Coast and across the United States, where I have never played before. Plus, I'm really excited to share that I will also be performing in an international city, since so many of you have been asking me to visit. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. And guess what? Tickets for this tour are available right now at tour.ballinstudios.com. In terms of the types of tickets you can buy, they range from general admission to VIP. Again, that's tour.ballinstudios.com. I'm also going to be giving away a trip to meet me at one of my live shows. And so if you want to enter for your chance to win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/Mr. Ballin. Again, that's fandiem.com/Mr. Ballin. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. A week and a half later, on February 19th, a young police officer knocked on the front door of a little house outside the town of Chartres in northern France. Now, up until this point, Alan's case had been treated as a simple missing persons case, with the local police in Alan's wife's hometown handling the inquiry, which was pretty basic. But now, enough time had passed without Alan being found and no evidence coming in that the original report had been kicked over to the crime division because they were thinking this could potentially be a kidnapping or something worse. This young officer was here at this home because it was the last place Alan was known to be before he went missing. The door of the home opened and a thin blonde woman looked out. The officer asked her if her name was Alexandra Nicola, and she said yes. When he explained to her why he was there, Alexandra looked immediately concerned and invited him inside. And as she led him into her living room and offered him a seat on her couch, The officer looked around, taking stock of the space. It was clean, but a bit cluttered, with toys that appeared to belong to a young girl scattered about. The officer scanned for any signs of a physical fight or violence of some kind, like damage to the walls or the furniture, but there was nothing that stood out, nothing concerning. Alexandra began asking the officer pretty anxiously all these questions about, what was going on with Alan. Was he hurt? Was he in some kind of danger? Like, what do you know? But the young officer just shook his head and said, for now, they really didn't know much. He was just here to try to build a timeline of Alan's last known movements. And so speaking of that, he asked Alexandra to please walk him through what she remembered about her last interaction with Alan. The officer took careful notes as Alexandra began to rattle off all the details she could remember. She said that Alan was like a surrogate father to her, and he had come over on the evening of Friday, February 5th. He had been there on Friday, also on Saturday and Sunday, and then he had taken off on that Sunday because he had to go to Vichy for this big meeting on Monday. She told the officer that after he left for that meeting, she hadn't heard from him, but that was pretty typical. She said their relationship was not remotely romantic, it really was platonic. And, he didn't always check in the way, a spouse would. This is more like really close friends. The officer nodded while he wrote down what she said. Alexandra seemed very helpful and appropriately worried, but he was suspicious of the idea that she and Alan were not romantically involved at all. So, before he left, he asked to see the rest of her house, in part just to see what her reaction would be. If she said no or got defensive, he would probe a bit more deeply. But she immediately agreed, and she actually took him all around the house, showing him anywhere he wanted to go. And what he found is the rest of the house seemed just as normal as the living room and the entryway. She eventually brought the officer back to the door and promised him she would call if Alan reached out. And so after leaving Alexandra's house, to be thorough, the officer actually went door to door up and down Alexandra's street, asking her neighbors what they remembered about that particular weekend and over the past several days, seeing if there was anything that contradicted what Alexandra had said. But everybody, more or less, confirmed Alexandra's story. Alan was indeed a regular visitor in the neighborhood, and several people did remember seeing him on the weekend in question and said that really nothing had seemed off. So eventually, the officer just left and went back to the station, and when he got there, he wrote a report highlighting Alan's last known destination of Vichy. Over the next week, police in Vichy, as well as in the ski town where Alan's wife lived, followed up on the loose threads of the investigation. They pored over Alan's cell phone history and his bank account and credit card transactions, which all showed no activity after he left Alexandra's house on February 7th. They also spoke to his business connections and his friends, but no one had heard anything. And they even put in a request to the car company Audi for the GPS data that was stored in Alan's car, which was an Audi Q7. Now, the investigators knew it was entirely possible that Alan had chosen to disappear. I mean, he was very wealthy, he had lots of connections, that was a possibility, that he had basically chosen to be gone. And if that was the case, it would be pretty difficult to find him. However, it was a lot harder to hide a car that logged all of its travel data. And so whether Alan's disappearance was voluntary, accidental, or the result of foul play, the police knew finding his Audi was likely the best hope they had of knowing where to even look for Alan. On February 26, 2010, so 19 days since Alan was reported missing, a detective named Pierre Martin stood in a secure impound lot in the city of Orléans, France, looking at Alan's gray Audi Q7. The GPS data that police had requested from Audi had come back a few days earlier, and it had led detectives to a surprising place. So again, the last place where Alan was known to have been before he vanished was leaving the home of his surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicolas, near Chartres, France, and heading to Vichy, France for a business meeting. But his Audi had not been found in Chartres or Vichy. Instead, it had been discovered in the parking lot of a train station in Orléans, which was in between those two cities. And so to the police, it sort of looked like he had gotten halfway to his destination and just stopped. Now, when they found this car, the first thing they did is they just put it under surveillance for 2 days to see if maybe Alan or somebody else would return to it. For context, the parking lot where this car was in a pretty rough area where violent crime and sex work were pretty common. So, any number of people could potentially, break into this car or who knows what. It just seemed like a seedy area where something might happen here if we keep watching. But nobody had shown up. So finally, they just towed the car to the impound lot for forensic technicians to process it and look for evidence. And Detective Martin was here to watch that process. The forensic techs circled the vehicle and began taking photos of the outside and also dusting for fingerprints. There was no visible damage anywhere on the outside of the car, and there were no traces of any effort to try to break into the car. Plus, Alan's briefcase and luggage were clearly still inside the car, which meant, the fact the car was found where it was likely not a product of a robbery. This didn't seem like somebody just stole his car. It's here and it has nothing to do with Alan's disappearance. It seems like how this car got here is connected in some way to what happened to Alan. And, sort of going down that path, it seemed more and more likely that what happened to Alan probably fell into the category of foul play. However, when the technicians opened up the car doors and began dusting for prints inside, the upholstery was disappointingly clean, which doesn't exactly sort of enhance the idea that foul play happened here. It just sort of seems like what's going on. But after a few minutes, after, kind of thoroughly scanning the inside of the car, one of the techs pushed the button near the driver's side that opened up the trunk. And then after it was open, Detective Martin walked around to the back to look inside and see what was in there. And what he saw was this bulky object wrapped in a pink sheet. And right away, Martin had this sinking feeling in his chest as one of the techs reached forward with a gloved hand and pulled the sheet back. And pretty much immediately, Martin's suspicions were confirmed. Underneath that pink sheet was a body, a man's body, fully clothed and curled in the fetal position. There was no doubt this was Alan Lilu. But there was no visible blood or wounds or bruises anywhere on his body, and there was no blood in the trunk. When Detective Martin reached in to try to move Alan's body to further examine him, he found his body was already incredibly rigid with rigor mortis. The coroner told Martin that she would hopefully have some answers for him after she did the autopsy. The weather over the past few weeks had been pretty cold, which was good for evidence collection because it basically meant the trunk had sort of acted like a refrigerator and preserved Alan's soft tissue. As the coroner wheeled the body away, Martin just stood there staring at the now empty trunk. He had no theories about when or why or even how Alan had died. All he knew was that this was now officially a murder investigation. Detective Martin returned to his office at the police station and got to work. Since Alan's body was found in Orléans, he was now in charge of the murder investigation. His first step was to review all the witness statements and other evidence that had already been gathered by the other departments. And right away, the picture they painted told Martin that this was going to be a very complex investigation with lots of suspects and multiple locations. Alan was a workaholic who was always on the move, and he had no apparent connection to the city of Orléans, where he had ended up. In fact, he rarely seemed to spend more than a few days in the same place. He didn't live with his wife. Instead, he seemed to bounce between his office and a series of hotels, with stops at the home of a woman named Alexandra Nicola in between. According to reports, Alexandra had been interviewed, and she said that Alan was at her house the weekend before he disappeared. And so this made her the last person to see Alan alive, which, in Martin's mind, clearly made her a suspect right off the bat. However, Alexandra's story about Alan leaving her house on Sunday, February 6th, matched up with the data Martin had from Alan's car, cell phone, and credit card records, which all showed that Alan really did leave her house and went to Orléans on that day, and then, for reasons unknown, stopped communicating or spending money. Maybe that was the day he was killed. Right off the bat, like the police officer who originally visited Alexandra and took down her original story, Detective Martin found it pretty hard to believe that her relationship with Alan was not romantic. It just seemed like, based on how frequently they apparently saw each other and the fact that Alan was buying her things and, bought her house and paid for vacations and things like that, it just seemed like there was more to the story than what he had been told. But even though that did totally cast some level of suspicion on Alexandra, there was also just the logical side of it for Detective Martin, which is like, okay, the size difference between Alan and Alexandra was stark. I mean, Alan was 240 pounds, a really big guy, and Alexandra was just very small and petite. Now, is it impossible for her to kill him and put him in the trunk of the car in Orleans? No. But it just makes it sort of unlikely. And so that's just sort of floating in the background of Detective Martin's mind. But for now, what Martin found himself much more interested in was some of the other information that Alan's business associates and wife had supplied. First off, Alan apparently had lots of affairs with lots of women. And so that meant every one of those women, and any husbands or boyfriends or other romantic partners of any kind connected to them, were also suspects. It also meant that Alan's wife, Elizabeth, had a motive to want her husband dead. I mean, basically, he's cheating on her openly all the time. That's got to be motivation for her to do something to him. Now, Martin didn't think that Elizabeth literally would have done the killing herself, because she was actually 400 miles away at her home when her husband died. But she certainly had the financial means to hire a hitman. And the second thing that Detective Martin got from the associates and from Alan's wife was Alan's business dealings were both very high stakes and very ugly. Alan's employees and colleagues clearly respected him, but they also described him as a very tough boss and a ruthless business person. He could be very loud and abrasive, and he had already made his fair share of enemies in the circus business, which was already known to be a cutthroat industry where a lot of money was flying around. And so because Martin had been handed this murder investigation, and really there's like an overwhelming number of people that could have been involved here, instead of just, not being sure where to start, Martin just assembled a team of his very best deputies, and they set to work literally re-interviewing everybody, and from that, making a list of suspects that they deemed were appropriate. Three weeks later, on March 17th, Detective Martin walked into an interrogation room in the Orleans police station, and he sat down across from a relatively fit-looking 50-year-old man who was waiting for him quietly and apparently very calmly. The man's name was Michel de la Rue, and he was Alan's biggest rival in the circus business. He was also, at this very moment, Detective Martin's #1 suspect in this murder. Martin and his team had spent the last few weeks conducting dozens and dozens of interviews, and Michel's name had come up more times than anybody else's. And this was because, immediately after Alan disappeared, Michel had begun contacting Alan's clients, trying to get them to all sign new contracts with him, sort of a pretty cutthroat and cold thing to do. And Detective Martin had done the math on these contracts Michel was going for, and they added up to the equivalent of millions of dollars, which in the detective's mind was a very compelling motive for murder. Maybe Michel killed this guy specifically to gobble up these contracts. And not only that, but the coroner had by this point come back with Alan's cause of death. He had been strangled using some kind of ligature, like a rope or a belt, and it likely took between 5 and maybe 10 minutes for Alan to actually be strangled to death. So, the idea is someone's actively strangling him for that long. That is a long time to be right there on top of somebody killing someone. And then the scratches that were found on Alan's legs suggested that his body had been lifted into the trunk after he was already dead. So the death struggle, the actual strangling, clearly took place outside of the trunk. And so all that meant whoever killed Alan had to be pretty strong. And looking at Michel now, Detective Martin thought that he did fit the description. He seemed like a pretty fit, strong guy. However, as Martin began asking Michel questions and watching his face and body language for signs of anxiety or defensiveness that could suggest he was hiding something, what he found was Michel seemed pretty open and very straightforward, like he was not hiding a thing. Michel immediately acknowledged poaching Alan's clients, but he just shrugged as he explained it. That was business. He said he was sure if somehow the positions were reversed, Alan would do the same thing to him. And also, he said he had an airtight alibi. On the weekend, when the coroner believed Alan had been killed, Michel had been hundreds of miles away skiing. And then Michel produced this folder full of these receipts and all these phone numbers, and he handed it over to Martin, who took it, and he told Michel, okay, sit tight. And then the detective got up and he left the interrogation room and he handed over this folder to another detective to check out. But after that, Detective Martin did not go back into the interrogation room. Instead, he grabbed another detective and told them to take a shot. The idea was to sort of have a good cop, bad cop sort of dynamic to see if maybe that would rattle Michel. And so Detective Martin watched from behind the two-way mirror as the next detective walked inside and took a stab at, breaking Michel. But their conversation basically played out the same way that Martin's had. So Martin signaled for another detective to go in there and have them take a shot. But they too had a sort of run-of-the-mill conversation with Michel, and they didn't make any progress. And then finally, after basically hours of cycling different detectives into the room to try to catch Michel in a lie, Detective Martin felt a tap on his shoulder. And when he turned around, it was one of his deputies who told Martin that unfortunately he had called all the people that Michel had given them information for, all the witnesses from the ski resort, and he had also even called the manager of the ski lodge. And basically, Michel's alibi checked out. He clearly had not been physically able to kill Alan. He was at that ski resort at the time of the murder. At this point, Martin knew he could not just keep Michel indefinitely and just keep trying to catch him in a lie. Even if there was some possibility here that he was involved in this murder, at this point, there just wasn't enough evidence. And so he had to let Michel go. A few days later, Martin was back at his desk combing through reports when a uniformed officer came up and told him there was somebody at the front desk who really wanted to talk to him. And this was exactly the kind of news that Martin had been hoping for. He had recently put out a statement to the local papers basically saying, hey, if there are any witnesses out there, please come in and talk to me. And he hoped that whoever this was potentially a witness. And so Detective Martin followed the uniformed officer out to the lobby, and there he saw the person who had come in to see him. It was this man who appeared to be in his early 50s, who was dressed all in black with these shiny black shoes and glasses. And Martin wondered if maybe this was a business contact of Alan's. And as he went up to shake the man's hand, he sort of felt himself getting excited. But then this man introduced himself, and when he did, Martin had to resist the urge to just turn around and walk away right there. Because the man said his name was Remy Saint-Touren, and he was a professional psychic. Martin did not believe in psychics, and he was annoyed with the police officer for even bringing him out here to meet this person. And so Martin was literally about to just tell Remy to, thanks for coming in, but I don't have time for this, you need to go. But then he thought better of it, because Martin was really having no luck with this case. There had been very little forensic evidence recovered from Alan's car. There were no usable fingerprints, and while the bedsheet Alan's body was wrapped in did have some DNA on it, it didn't match anything in their system. And then the business leads that Martin had been pretty excited about hadn't panned out either, and he'd found no evidence that anyone in either Alan's personal or business circles took out a paid hit on him. Martin's team had also spoken at length to Alan's surrogate daughter, Alexandra, and all the women he was having affairs with, and all the sex workers he had engaged with, and none of them, nor any of their boyfriends or husbands or partners, made sense as the killer. So, out of a mixture of a little curiosity and a lot of desperation, Martin brought Remy the psychic back to an interrogation room and asked him what he thought. Remy explained that he had heard a news bulletin about Alan while he was driving, and when he heard it, he had a vision that was so vivid that he actually had to pull over. He said he saw Alan Lilu as clear as day in this physical struggle with a woman. Remy didn't know her name, and he couldn't describe her, but he was certain that a woman was somehow involved in Alan's murder. Martin was disappointed because, unsurprisingly, this just sort of felt like a generic stab in the dark by somebody parading around as a psychic who could see things that nobody else could. It just seemed like he threw this random generic thing out there as if it was some big revelation, and it just didn't feel like it was. But Remy wasn't done. He went on to say he was sure that Alan was not killed in Orleans, even though that's where his body had been found. He said Alan's body had been taken away from the murder scene and actually placed in the trunk after he was dead. And this caught Martin's attention, because the coroner had been certain that Alan was strangled in one place and then placed into the trunk afterwards for transportation. But critically, the police had not released that information to the press, specifically because they wanted to be able to weed out fake tips. And so for Remy to say that, how would he have access to that? Now, Martin knew this could have just been a lucky guess by Remy, but it just seemed so, on the nose that he began considering what else Remy had said. This idea that, okay, Alan was struggling with this woman. That was something that, Martin had not really considered. He had sort of ruled most women out as the potential suspect because of how big Alan had been and how physical this murder had to have been. So it just seemed more likely that a big, strong man was responsible for the killing. But now, Martin wasn't so sure. And suddenly it seemed entirely possible that, maybe a woman really did do this. And so eventually, Detective Martin thanked Remy for coming in and sharing his ideas about the case. And then after walking him out of the station, Detective Martin sped back to his desk. Because Martin had an idea. Lots of people in Alan's life had told the police investigating his murder that Alan had had lots of extramarital affairs. Now, Detective Martin and his team had spoken to all the women they could possibly find who had had these affairs with Alan, and basically all of them had been ruled out. However, now, after talking with Remy the psychic, something about the location where Alan's body was found was jumping out at Detective Martin. The part of Orleans where Alan's car had been parked was pretty sketchy, it was crime-ridden, and critically, it was known for being a hotbed for sex work. Now, Martin already knew, clearly, that Alan engaged with sex workers. It just seemed like that was one of the things that he did, and they spoke to numerous sex workers and ruled them out as being suspects. And so for the most part, sex workers were not really on Detective Martin's radar as, primary suspect pool. However, now with fresh eyes, he was thinking, maybe the reason Alan was in Orleans was because he was there to meet a sex worker, and while he was there, something went wrong, and it resulted in his death. So, Detective Martin spent the next few days absolutely scouring Alan's laptop. Now, the forensic techs had already been through it once, looking at all of Alan's emails and business records, but Martin was looking at something different. He was using the laptop to search through all the websites where Alan had found sex workers to go visit. Basically, what he was doing is making a true exhaustive list of every single sex worker he had ever really engaged with. So this is an even bigger list than they had before. There were dozens of names and profiles to sift through, and as Martin found them, he would send members of his team out to speak to all the women he possibly could. But as he was doing this, Detective Martin discovered that really none of these sex workers that Alan was engaging with had any connection to Orleans, and they also did not appear to have any real issues with Alan himself, at least based on the messages that were on his laptop. However, as Detective Martin dug deeper and deeper into this laptop, going further and further back in time, he eventually came to one new profile, this woman named Marie Eve. And when he took in who this woman was and got a picture of her and saw her information, he knew right then and there he had solved the case. Based on the entire police investigation, as well as a confession from the killer, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Alan Leloup on the day he was murdered. the killer found themselves standing behind Alan, and inside they were burning with rage. Alan seemed to think he was so much better than the killer, just because he was this powerful businessman, and the killer was just a sex worker. And the killer had tolerated Alan's behavior because, Alan had money. But now, Alan had pushed it too far, and the killer felt like they had to shut him up for good. Alan's belt lay nearby, and impulsively, the killer grabbed it and lunged forward and looped the belt around Alan's throat. And at first, Alan struggled. He reached up, he's trying to pull the belt off, he has no idea what's happening, but the killer just held on tight. And for several minutes, there's this unbelievable death struggle going on. And Alan, he's fighting. He's a big guy and he's getting close to pulling this thing off. But then something sort of unbelievable happened. The killer had sort of braced themselves against an object behind them. And so their back is up against it and they're pulling as hard as they can with this belt against Alan's throat. And as they're leaning back, the object they're up against suddenly broke. And because, the killer didn't let go of the belt and is applying max pressure, when they fell backwards, it created almost like this whiplash effect. Their body tumbles and all that force is driven into Alan's throat. And what happened is that sudden whiplash crushed Alan's larynx and he immediately went still. And so just for good measure, the killer held on for a couple more minutes, pulling as tightly as they could across his throat, really ensuring that Alan was dead. And when Alan did not move at all, eventually the killer let go of the belt and stood up, their heart pounding, just sort of taking in the scene. Then, as reality began to set in for the killer, they realized they needed help getting rid of this body. This is a huge guy. How are they going to get rid of it on their own? So the killer called their accomplice. And the accomplice was hundreds of miles away in a ski resort, but they immediately told the killer to wait and they would drive to them. Sure enough, the next day, the accomplice arrived and they helped the killer load Alan's body into the trunk of Alan's car. Then the killer climbed into Alan's car and drove it to the train station in Orleans. Behind them, as they made this ride, police would realize much later there was a second car being driven by the killer's accomplice. The killer and the accomplice would abandon Alan's car and his body in Orleans, and then together they would drive away, and shortly thereafter, they would actually get married. Because the killer was Alan's own surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicola. Alexandra's troubled past that she was very defensive about included the fact that she was actually a sex worker under the name Marie Eve. Her accomplice was her new boyfriend, Yves Bernard. So Alexandra and Alan had fought previously about her, troubled history, and she was especially mad that at one point, Alan had implied that Alexandra's daughter could sort of end up like her, as if that would be a horrible thing. So on Saturday, February 6th, when Alan brought up Alexandra's daughter, just sort of in conversation, for Alexandra, something snapped. It just felt so disrespectful that he, again, was talking about her daughter, and sort of out of impulse, she grabbed the belt, wrapped it around Alan's neck, strangled him, and ultimately stumbled backwards and crushed his larynx and killed him. In a way, it was sort of true what Alexandra had told the police when they initially questioned her, that Alan had left her house in his car on February 7th, and she had not seen him again. What she had left out was that Alan was already dead in the trunk of his car when he left. Alexandra Nicola confessed to the murder of Alan Lilu and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Her boyfriend, Yves Bernard, was sentenced to 2 years for concealment of a dead body. The couple has since been released, and together they have a child who was born before Alexandra went to prison. At around 5 p.m. on the evening of October 27, 2017, a 29-year-old woman named Alexia Duval drove her car down a cul-de-sac in the small, quiet town of Gray, France. She was on her way to her parents' house to celebrate her nephew's second birthday, and it was going to be this big family get-together. Her sister, her brother-in-law, and her little nephew had come in all the way from Paris, which was about a 4-hour drive away. But Alexia realistically had mixed feelings about seeing them all tonight. So Alexia had been going through a pretty hard time recently. She and her husband of 13 years, Jonathan, had been trying to get pregnant, and so she'd done several rounds of fertility treatments, which had thrown her hormones completely out of whack and seemed to affect her a lot more than was typical for most women. And then finally, when all that had led to her actually getting pregnant, she unfortunately had miscarried just a couple of months ago. And so even though Alexia loved her sister's family and got along with them really well, her miscarriage was still really fresh in her mind, and she just knew it was going to be very difficult for her to be around her young nephew. It was just a reminder of what she had lost. Now, Alexia came to a stop outside of a gated driveway at the end of the cul-de-sac, and she rang the intercom. And then when the gate opened up, she drove up the driveway toward a nice house with a very well-kept garden. She parked her car in the driveway behind her father's white van, and then got out of her car. She grabbed a wrapped present out of the back seat, along with a couple of desserts that she'd made, carried them up to the house, and rang the doorbell. And a few seconds later, her mother, Isabelle Fouillot, answered the door with a big smile and led her into the dining room where Alexia's father, Jean-Pierre, sat at the table, talking with Alexia's brother-in-law, Gregory, and also her sister, Stephanie. They all stood up and they greeted her, and then as Alexia began to explain that her husband Jonathan was running late and he'd be here later in a separate car because the job he'd been working that day as an electrician had run long, as she was saying all that, Alexia heard the sound of little feet making their way towards her. A moment later, her 2-year-old nephew, James, ran around the corner and threw his arms around Alexia's legs. And surprisingly, to Alexia's relief, she didn't feel sadness. All she felt was happiness. And so she bent down and scooped him up and gave the boy a big hug, and then she also handed him his birthday present. Eventually, the group settled in for dinner, and for a while, all of Alexia's worries just kind of faded away. She was really close with everybody at the table, especially her mother and her sister Stephanie, and being around them always put her in a good mood. Alexia's husband, Jonathan, finally arrived sometime around 8:30, and he, along with the rest of the group, had a wonderful night, eating and drinking and chatting. After dinner was cleaned up, Alexia's father did go to bed, but everybody else stayed up, and they all just continued having this nice time until around 11 p.m., when Alexia said it was really time for her and Jonathan to head home. They both had early mornings ahead of them. Jonathan had some errands to run in the morning, and Alexia was hoping to get a workout in. A few minutes later, on the drive home, Alexia sat in the passenger seat of Jonathan's car. She'd left her own car at her parents' house because she'd been drinking, and she was planning to pick it up when they came back the next day. Alexia and Jonathan's house was on a quiet residential street, only about a mile away from Alexia's parents' house. And as they made their way down the road, Alexia glanced out the window at a particular house that was just up the street from where they lived. And as she looked at it, she frowned. The neighbor who lived in that house had an adult grandson who had been harassing Alexia all summer. He'd been obsessed with her and would call and text her constantly, to the point where Alexia didn't feel safe even going out for a jog around the block when she was by herself. Now, fortunately, the harassment had stopped a couple of months ago, but only because the man had been committed to a mental hospital. But Alexia didn't really know how long it would be until he got out again, or if he'd already been released. She didn't know, so it just sort of felt like a reprieve, not a long-term solution. But on this night at least, there was nobody peering out at her from the neighbor's window. A minute later, their car pulled into their garage, and Alexia and Jonathan got out. And as Alexia went from the garage into the main house, she passed by a treadmill in the corner of the garage, which had broken down a few weeks ago. She asked Jonathan if he'd gotten around to fixing it yet, and he said no. Alexia just sighed. It was supposed to be a very cold and gloomy morning the next day, and so it looked like she was going to have to run outside. The following morning, around 11 a.m., Jonathan walked up to the door of Alexia's parents' house and rang the doorbell. And as he did, he sort of gave a worried look over his shoulder at Alexia's car, which was still parked where they'd left it the night before. Jonathan took a deep breath and tried not to show how anxious he felt as Alexia's mother, Isabelle, answered the door. And then, in a very shaky voice, Jonathan said hello and asked her if she'd seen or heard from her daughter recently. And when Isabelle said she had not, Jonathan completely lost his composure. He said that morning Alexia had gone out for a jog, but not come back, and now he was starting to get really worried. He explained that he'd tried texting Alexia, but she still hadn't answered, and by this point, she should have been home a long time ago, so something was wrong. A moment later, Jonathan saw Stephanie and Gregory coming out of the guest room with very concerned looks on their faces. They joined Jonathan and Isabel at the front door and asked what the commotion was about. And so Jonathan sort of frantically re-explained the situation and asked if either of them had heard from Alexia in the last hour or so. But they shook their heads and said they hadn't. But Stephanie showed Jonathan that she had received a text from Alexia at 9:30 that morning, just to say that she was going out for this jog. But after that, none of them had received any texts or calls from Alexia. Jonathan was crying at this point, and so Alexia's family tried to assure him that, Alexia would probably just show up at the house any minute here, like nothing's going on. I'm sure she's just running late. And Jonathan, he wanted to believe this. But this was completely unusual. Like, this was not normal for Alexia to be gone for this long without being in touch. It just didn't make sense. It was at this point that Jonathan's brother-in-law, Gregory, reached out and put his hand on Jonathan in a sort of comforting way and just said, look, if it makes you feel any better, I'll go back with you and we can literally go look for Alexia together, or at least be together until she comes back. Jonathan didn't really know what to do, but he was very thankful and said, yep, that would be great. And so a couple of minutes later, the two men got in Gregory's SUV and they began driving back towards their house. But Jonathan actually navigated him through the streets along the running route that Alexia usually took to see if maybe they could find her. They drove down all the side streets looking for her. And then when they reached the edge of town, Jonathan and Gregory got out of the car and began checking the paths leading into the countryside and also the ditches and the banks of the river. But they didn't find Alexia anywhere. And then eventually, they just drove back to Jonathan and Alexia's house to see if maybe she'd finally come home with an explanation for all this, but she had not come home. At this point, Jonathan was completely beside himself, and so Gregory, doing his best to stay calm, said, you know what, let's go to the hospital and see if Alexia had turned up there. A few minutes later, when they stopped in the parking lot of the local hospital, Jonathan jumped out of the car and ran towards the main entrance, where two nurses were taking a cigarette break. Jonathan told these nurses that he was here looking for his wife and that she'd gone on a run 3 hours ago and no one knew where she was now and maybe she's here. So the nurses, who could clearly tell this was an emergency, they put out their cigarettes and went inside to check the register. But a minute later, they came back and told the men that no, Alexia Duvall had not been admitted that morning. She was not here. Before Jonathan or Gregory could protest or ask more questions, the nurses just said, look, you gotta go to the police. Picture this. You're doing some online shopping, and all of a sudden, you see it. That one product that you've been looking for. You add it to your cart, and as you're filling in your address, you realize you don't have your card anywhere near you. And just when you're about to give up, you see that purple pay button. One tap, and you're checked out in seconds. Shopify's Shop Pay button is used by millions of businesses all around the world, and it's why Shopify has the best converting checkout on the planet. It also helps boost conversions, meaning less carts going abandoned and more sales for you. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the entire United States, from household names like Heinz and Mattel to brands that are just getting started. See less carts go abandoned and more sales with Shopify and their Shop Pay button. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/MrBallin. Go to shopify.com/MrBallin. Again, that is shopify.com/MrBallin. Later that afternoon, a police officer named Adeline P.O. sat across from Jonathan in a room at the Gray Police Station as he explained what had happened with his wife, that she was missing. Jonathan also gave a description of what Alexia had been wearing when she went out running. Bright pink shoes, black leggings, and a red jacket, so pretty easy to spot. And then after describing her and sort of realizing the weight of what he was here for, he just put his head in his hands and continued to weep, as he had been doing much of the morning. Now, P.O. could obviously tell that Jonathan was very upset here, but she had to ask the question that was already forming in her mind. So, as delicately as possible, she asked Jonathan if his wife had any suicidal tendencies, or any reason she might have run off without telling anybody. Jonathan looked up really quickly and just shook his head and said no, and said that overall his wife was very happy and definitely not suicidal. However, as he sat there thinking about it, he said she had been taking hormones for fertility, and realistically, those hormones appeared to have affected her really badly. For example, sometimes she would lose control of her emotions entirely and even become violent. Or in other instances, he said that she would even have memory lapses, where she wouldn't even know what she was doing when she was doing it. It was like she had become this different person. P.O. nodded and just listened to Jonathan and wrote down everything he was saying. And then when he was done, She followed up and said, can you think of anybody who might have had a problem with Alexia? And for a moment, Jonathan just sat there in silence, kind of mulling over the question. And then suddenly his eyes went wide, like he had just realized something. He told P.O. that they had a neighbor who had been completely obsessed with Alexia earlier that year. He said his name was Arnaud, and he'd been obsessively calling and texting her so many times that Alexia had actually had to block his number, and had actually talked about how she was fearful of going out alone because of this neighbor. But just a couple of months earlier, he had been sent to a psychiatric hospital, and because he was literally removed from the neighborhood, the harassment had stopped. But Jonathan said they were kind of worried that at some point he would come back and then he would be a problem again. And realistically, Jonathan said, he could be home now. I just don't know. I don't know where he is. P.O. was obviously very intrigued by this. And so after this interview was over with Jonathan, she and her investigative team began digging into this Arnaud guy to see where he was and what was going on with him. And pretty quickly, they discovered that while Arnaud had gone to that psychiatric hospital, that was true, he was not there anymore. He had been released. And so that night, another officer with the Gray Police knocked on the door of Arnaud's mother's house, where Arnaud was staying, which was about an hour away from Alexia and Jonathan's house. After the officer knocked, a middle-aged woman answered the door. And when the officer asked if she was Arnaud's mother, she said she was. The officer looked past her, and he could see there was this disheveled-looking young man sitting right inside. And he asked the mother if that was Arnaud. And again, the woman said yes. At this point, the officer asked the mother if he could come inside, because he said he needed to speak privately with her son. The mother and Arnaud in the background both seemed very confused by this, but after a minute, they both agreed, and the officer came inside. And so the officer went inside the house and sat down in the living room with Arnaud, while Arnaud's mother went to the kitchen to give the men some privacy. And then once the mother was gone, the officer looked at Arnaud and just said he had some questions about Alexia Duvall. Arnaud immediately looked down at this question, like he was embarrassed and couldn't even look at the officer. But then he looked back up again and told the officer that he had bipolar disorder, and sometimes when he was in a manic state, he acted inappropriately towards women, including Alexia. The officer followed up about all those messages that apparently Arnaud had sent to Alexia that summer, like what was going on with that. And Arnaud admitted that he had done that, but he insisted it really was no big deal. He said that he and Alexia knew each other because they had been neighbors at one point, and they'd also hung out in a group setting once, and so him being in touch with her was not totally weird, like they had a real connection. But Arnaud clarified that when Alexia told him to stop contacting her, he did. And that was the end of it. But this caught the officer's attention, because according to Alexia's husband, Jonathan, the only reason that all the calls and texts had stopped was because Alexia literally had to block Arnaud's phone number. So the officer just cut to the chase here and told Arnaud that Alexia was missing. And then before Arnaud could say anything, the officer asked him where he'd been that morning at 9 a.m. And Arnaud said, I was right here. I was at home with my mom. For a moment, the officer just stared at Arnaud, trying to read his body language to see if maybe he was being deceptive or not. So eventually, the officer just stood up and went into the kitchen where the mother was. And he asked the mother, "Where was your son this morning?" And she told the officer with sort of a bewildered look on her face that he was here with me all morning. And so at this point, it was clear to the officer that, if the mother was telling the truth here, it would officially rule out Arnaud as a suspect because, he was here. But the officer also knew that, generally speaking, mothers do not make the best alibis because mothers are known to lie, cheat, steal, and do anything to protect their kids. The following afternoon, on Sunday, October 29th, Chief Officer Frank Paredes glanced out his office window as yet another news van sped past outside down the usually quiet streets of Gray. By now, Alexia's disappearance had blown up into this huge national news story, and this was making it really difficult for Paredes, who was in charge of the investigation. Now, it was still early in the investigation, but already he and his investigators were being hounded by reporters and camera crews at every step. Paredes closed his eyes and tried to focus on what his next step should be. The search effort was well underway. They had called in reinforcements from nearby towns and even organized search teams with volunteers from the public. At that very moment, law enforcement was also using drones and dogs to scour the town and the surrounding woods. Paredes's investigation team had also searched Jonathan and Alexia's home by now, secretly hoping they might find something to pin the disappearance on Jonathan. But there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and no clues that gave them any direction there. And also, all of Alexia's other family members, her parents, her sister Stephanie, and her brother-in-law Gregory, they could all vouch for each other's whereabouts on the morning of Alexia's disappearance. They claimed they had all been at the house together. And so without any real leads, Paredes had gotten so desperate for any information that he'd literally told his team to set up checkpoints out in the streets and just stop random people and ask them if they had seen or heard anything that could help them find Alexia. And now, as Paredes sat in his office wondering what he was going to do today, he heard a knock at his door. And a moment later, one of his investigators entered with fairly surprising news. The checkpoints actually had turned up something. Paredes listened intently as the investigator explained that a number of people he'd spoken to had mentioned a van. Now, no one had actually seen the van themselves, but they all appeared to have heard the same rumor, that apparently there was a man driving around the area in this white van, and he was known to harass girls and women right out on the street. Now, at first glance, Paredes was worried that perhaps this was just like an unfounded rumor, but then he remembered there were actually two men in Alexia's family who literally drove white vans. Her father, Jean-Pierre, he owned one, and her husband, Jonathan, he drove one for work. On the afternoon of Monday, October 30th, so a little more than 2 days after Alexia went missing, Paredes brought his car to a stop next to a news van parked in the middle of the woods about 4 miles outside of town. Minutes ago, he had received a call from an officer in the field telling him that Alexia's body had been found. And so Paredes had driven out to the scene as fast as he could. But now that Paredes was here at the crime scene, he could tell obviously he was late to the game because, a news crew was already here, setting up their cameras near a row of police barriers. And Paredes was disappointed to see this because he'd hoped that if and when her body was discovered, if she was found dead, at that time he would have had at least one suspect, or hopefully multiple suspects, identified and under surveillance before the word got out to the general public that Alexia was found dead. But now he obviously would not get that chance. Paredes sighed, climbed out of his car, and flashed his badge to an officer who led him around the barriers and into the crime scene. Paredes approached one of the forensics experts who was taking photos and placing yellow numbered markers around on the ground, and Paredes introduced himself as the lead investigator. The expert then led him over to Alexia's body, which was lying on the ground between two tree trunks, covered by a white bedsheet. Her pink running shoes were poking out from under the sheet, and Paredes noticed that her feet and the sheet were both partially burned, as if someone had tried to set them on fire at some point. Once the scene had been fully photographed, Paredes bent down and lifted the sheet to get a better look at Alexia's body. She was lying on her back, and there were bruises all over her face, and there were also marks on her neck that looked like they were from strangulation. And right away, Paredes noticed a couple of things that were unusual. First, Alexia's hands were placed neatly in the pockets of her coat, as though her body had been placed there on the ground with a lot of care. Second, despite the beating that Alexia's face had apparently taken, her glasses were placed perfectly on her face. And so to Paredes, it seemed like whoever killed Alexia had felt some sort of remorse afterwards. It was as though the killer had committed this incredibly violent murder, but then had tried to kind of put everything back in order afterward. And this made Paredes think that Alexia's killer was very likely someone who knew Alexia, and not a stranger who simply, accosted her during a jog. Just then, Paredes heard somebody call his name, and he stood up to take a look. Nearby, there was a forensics tech that was waving him over. And so Paredes walked over, and the tech showed Paredes what he had just found. It was a gray plastic cap that looked like it belonged on some kind of spray can. Paredes thought, maybe this could help explain the strange burn marks on the bedsheet and also Alexia's shoes. The killer had probably sprayed something on the body to try and help it catch fire, but it didn't work as well as they thought it would. Just then, another forensics tech called Paredes over to them to show him something else they had found: tire tracks in the dirt. Paredes immediately thought about that tip that he had been given about this van with this person driving around town harassing women and girls, and he wondered if maybe that was true, that this van was involved and that these had been left by the killer when they were transporting Alexia's body. And so as this forensics expert began taking photographs of the tire tracks, Paredes made a mental note to examine the tires of every suspect, family member, and other persons of interest they came across. just in case one of them was a match. And so Paredes was about to turn his attention back to the body when he noticed one more unusual thing out in the woods. There was this young man who did not appear to be a reporter, just kind of wandering around out there in the trees, almost lurking near the crime scene. And so immediately, Paredes went over to this guy and demanded to know what he was doing here. And at this, the man went completely wide-eyed and just started stuttering like he was totally caught off guard. Eventually, the guy managed to mumble that he was just out here picking mushrooms, but Paredes could tell he was obviously lying. That was not why he was out here. And so, operating on sort of a gut instinct, Paredes pulled out his handcuffs and placed the man under arrest. Later that same afternoon, just hours after Alexia's body had been discovered in the woods outside of town, Paredes sat down at a table at the Gray police station across from this suspicious young man he just arrested for lurking near the crime scene for no clear reason. And Paredes was pleased. I mean, he'd only been in charge of what was now a murder investigation for a couple of hours, and here he was about to speak to a legitimate suspect, really like the first suspect, who was in custody. But as soon as Paredes actually began speaking to this suspect, he realized that the young man's stutter was not really a sign of him being nervous. He actually had speech issues, and he struggled to speak at all, even when he wasn't nervous. The man was eventually able to explain that his name was Anthony, and he was 29 years old. He said he lived with his parents in Apremont, another small town about 5 miles away, and he admitted that he had lied about being there to pick mushrooms. And so Paredes pressed Anthony to explain then why he was there. And Anthony, he seemed a little embarrassed as he began to explain, but what he said was he didn't know Alexia personally. He had just heard about her disappearance in the news, and he wanted to help with the search effort. But Anthony said he couldn't read or write, so he had not been able to fill out the paperwork to join the official search party. So instead, he'd just driven out to the woods in his own car to look for Alexia himself. But while he was out there, the police showed up, and clearly there was something going on, and when Paredes walked over to him, Anthony said he got scared and just lied and said, "Oh, I'm out here picking mushrooms." Like he said it was just embarrassment. And as Paredes sat there listening to the story, he wasn't quite sure what to make of it, or really what to make of Anthony. Anthony's demeanor seemed almost childlike, but his behavior was not childlike. It was very adult-like and pretty suspicious. So Paredes followed up by asking him what he was doing on the morning of October 28th, which was the morning Alexia went missing. Anthony said he'd woken up at his parents' house and had breakfast with them before he went out with his girlfriend and also another friend. And he gave Paredes their names and also their phone numbers so they could confirm it. So Paredes stepped out of the room, and he did exactly that. He called the various phone numbers and spoke to the people in Anthony's life, and they all corroborated his alibi. So despite how suspicious Anthony had been acting, Paredes had no choice but to let Anthony go. A week later, on November 5th, a march was organized in Alexia's honor. 10,000 people turned out to show their support for Alexia's family and also to protest violence against women. And hidden among this huge crowd was a pair of police officers who'd been assigned to follow Alexia's husband, Jonathan Duvall. At this point, Jonathan really was looking like the most obvious suspect, since he was the husband and also the last person to see Alexia alive. So the police had tapped his phone and put him under surveillance. But all they had learned so far from the phone taps was that Jonathan made frequent calls to Alexia's family, to his own siblings and his friends, to talk about how much he missed his wife. And the officers who were literally following Jonathan around found that he really rarely left his house except to visit Alexia's parents, which he did almost every day. But so far, it was like none of Jonathan's behavior actually seemed really suspicious at all. And now, at this big march, the investigators stood in the crowd and watched as Jonathan hobbled his way up the steps to the podium, followed by Alexia's mother and father. And in fact, Jonathan was trembling so much by the time he got up there that Alexia's parents had to physically prop him up before he could begin reading his speech to the crowd. And so at this point, the investigators just kind of exchanged a glance. Either they were wasting their time following an obviously grieving husband with nothing to hide, or Jonathan was like a world-class actor giving the performance of a lifetime. But the investigators knew that until new evidence presented itself, there was really nothing they could do but, watch and wait, which included watching Jonathan and just seeing what he did. They were also still waiting on the tire analysis from the crime scene, but they didn't expect much to come from it. At this point, the creepy white van story seemed to be more like an urban legend in this town. And so, as the weeks turned to months and still there was no progress on this case, the investigators, including Paredes, began to wonder if this case would ever be solved. But then, all of a sudden, new evidence did appear. And when it did, the investigators realized they might have been following the wrong lead this whole time. Because while they'd been focused on surveilling Jonathan, a second body had just turned up in the woods outside of Gray. On the evening of Saturday, January 6th, 2018, Chief Officer Paredes was at his desk, poring over the evidence that had been flooding in all day. The new victim, whose body had been found earlier that same day in the woods, very close to where Alexia's body had been found, was a 38-year-old father of 3. He looked to have died from a gunshot wound to the head, although, according to the autopsy report, the man had a blood alcohol level of almost 0.4%, which is huge. That can be fatal on its own, or at the very least, knock somebody unconscious. Investigators had found gunpowder on the man's hand, so for now, they were treating his death as a suicide. But the more Paredes looked into the evidence, the less convinced he became that he was looking at a suicide. Because, a gun had been found at the scene, but it had not been located very close to the dead man's body. In fact, the gun was found 130 feet away from the body in a trash can. The only explanation would be he shot himself and then put the gun in the trash can and then somehow wandered 130 feet away before collapsing and dying. That was possible, albeit highly unlikely. Being shot in the head typically is immediately incapacitating or lethal, but it is possible he could have shot himself and lived long enough to travel the 130 feet. It just seemed very unlikely. So now Paredes sat back in his chair and just tried to think. It was strange enough to have 2 violent deaths in this same quiet town, let alone to have the bodies be found basically in the exact same spot in the surrounding woods. It just seemed too coincidental not to be looked into. So he had to wonder, maybe there was a connection between this man's death and Alexia's. But later that same month, as Paredes scanned over a document that had just arrived from the crime lab, he wasn't thinking about that second body in the woods anymore. Because this new document in his hands was an expert analysis of those tire tracks that had been found in the woods near Alexia's body. And the analysis showed that there was a tiny defect in the tread of one of the tires. And this defect was so specific that the experts had been able to determine exactly which vehicle left those tracks in the woods. And this vehicle just so happened to be a white van. Paredes felt his pulse quicken as he kept on reading, and a moment later, he reached for his phone and he called his supervisor to tell him the good news. He knew the identity of Alexia's killer. Based on that tire track analysis and also other evidence, including an eventual confession from the killer, this is how police believe Alexia Duvall was killed. The killer was almost blind with rage. They slammed Alexia's head against a nearby wall and then hit her over and over again. And then they wrapped their hands around her neck and they squeezed for so long they lost track of time. They were just crushing her neck. And then finally, they couldn't feel her pulse under their fingers anymore. Then, looking down at Alexia's motionless body on the ground, they realized the severity of what they had just done. And so the killer, in a panic, crouched down next to her and actually tried to wake her up, but it was too late. She was dead. And so now they're really panicking. They thought about maybe killing themselves out of guilt, but they were too scared to go through with it. So instead, they hatched a plan to get rid of Alexia's body. The killer very carefully put Alexia's glasses back on her face, and then they lifted her up and they carried her body out to their vehicle. Then they drove out to the woods and dragged her body by the feet to a secluded spot deep in the trees where they hoped nobody would ever find her. They covered Alexia's body in a sheet, and then they sprayed the sheet with this foam that they thought was flammable, hoping that once they lit it on fire, it would help, dispose of the body. But when they got their lighter out and held the flame to the sheet, it didn't really work. And so finally, when it was clear they were not going to be able to burn the body here, the killer just left her there and then drove away in their white van, getting home in time to dispose of all the evidence, take a shower, and start the next phase of the cover-up, which was to knock on Alexia's mother's door in a fake panic, asking if anybody had seen her daughter. Because Alexia's killer was her own husband, Jonathan. It turns out, Alexia never even went for a run on the morning of October 28th. She was murdered the night before, after she and Jonathan had gotten back from her parents' house. They had gotten into a big fight, which obviously resulted in her death. From the outside, Jonathan and Alexia appeared to be a very happy couple, but in reality, they'd been arguing more and more often, primarily because they were not able to have a baby. It was causing a lot of friction in their marriage. And so on the night of October 27th, in the middle of this horrible fight they're having, Jonathan grabbed his keys and tried to leave, but Alexia told him to stop running away from their problems and tried to literally take the keys from him. And according to Jonathan, that's when he just snapped and he killed her. And then he used his work van to dispose of the body. As for that second body that was found in the woods months later, that was determined to be a suicide and completely unrelated to Alexia's death. Jonathan was arrested on January 28, 2018, and 2 days after his arrest, he confessed to the murder. At the end of his trial in 2020, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. On the afternoon of April 25, 2007, a 25-year-old police officer named Martin Arnold and his partner Michelle sat in their police cruiser in the parking lot of a public park in Heilbronn, Germany. They were on their lunch break, and Martin was eating a sandwich and looking out across the park, which was mostly empty because it was a weekday afternoon. So Heilbronn was a medium-sized city in southern Germany, and it was generally a pretty safe area. I mean, for the most part, the worst crimes committed here were like break-ins or muggings. So Martin and his partner, they didn't have a whole lot of action happening around them. However, something Martin and Michelle and basically all police officers, for the most part, in Germany were acutely aware of was over the last 14 years, all across Germany, there had been this rash of crimes ranging from, home invasions and robberies to at least 2 murders that had basically all been committed based on DNA evidence by the same person, this singular woman whose nickname was the woman with no face. And she still hadn't been caught yet. And so, in essence, all police officers in Germany were sort of like always on the lookout for this woman. She was like the most elusive and sought-after criminal in the whole country. But on this particular day, as Martin sat in his cruiser on his lunch break, he wasn't really thinking about how he might get involved in capturing the woman with no face. Instead, he was just worried about his sandwich. And so he went to take another bite of his sandwich when he heard the back doors of his cruiser open up. And he whipped around and he looked, and there were these 2 people who had approached the cruiser, and each of them were carrying a gun. And before Martin or Michelle could do anything, these people raised their weapons and they fired, and everything went black. Within minutes, officers from the Heilbronn Police Department had swarmed the scene. They found Michelle, who was deceased from a gunshot wound to the head. And Martin had also been shot in the head, but he was still alive. He was just unconscious. And so an ambulance rushed him to the hospital while detectives taped off the crime scene and began looking for evidence. Some officers immediately began canvassing the area looking for potential witnesses. But because the park was basically empty all day, there was nobody who had seen the shooting. Other officers looked for footprints in the ground, around the car. They also began looking for fingerprints on the car, bullet casings, hairs, other fibers inside or outside the car. But there was nothing. And so at this point, the investigators are like, okay, all we know is there's been at least one shooter, maybe multiple, because they have not spoken to Martin, who's unconscious. They have no idea what he's seen. So they're seeing that at least one person has managed to come up to a police cruiser, undetected presumably, open up the doors, shoot both officers in the head, and then get away without leaving behind any obvious evidence. It just seemed crazy. Like, have we just missed something? Like, there's got to be something here that sort of points us in the direction of who was responsible. And so in a last-ditch attempt to find something helpful at the crime scene, one officer swabbed the inside of the car for potential DNA evidence. They knew that if there was DNA, it could belong to Martin or Michelle or anybody else who might have been inside of this car, and any of those people didn't have to be the shooter or shooters. They could just be people in the car. But it was possible that DNA found inside that car could belong to whoever did this. However, they wouldn't know about this DNA sample until the crime lab analyzed the swabs, and that could take a really long time. But it was certainly worth it, and so they sent the swabs off for testing. While they waited for the DNA results to come in, the Heilbronn PD continued trying to find witnesses or any other helpful evidence, anything, but they kept coming up empty. Their only potential witness here was Martin himself, but he was still in a coma at the hospital. It was not until weeks later that finally the police had something to go on, because the DNA results came back. And not only was there DNA found in the car, but what this DNA revealed sent the media into a frenzy and brought this investigation to the national level. At this time, it's mid-2007, and a 44-year-old German prosecutor named Gunther Horn was sitting in his office when he got a call from his boss. And his boss told him, the woman without a face has struck again, this time in Heilbronn. Gunther's eyes went wide, and he immediately sat up and listened really intently as his boss explained that 2 police officers in Heilbronn had been shot in the head while parked in their cruiser near this park, and the woman with no face, her DNA had been found in the backseat of their car. Now, Gunther had always been fascinated by the woman without a face, so he was ecstatic when his boss asked if he, Gunther, would lead the investigation into this most recent crime in Heilbronn that was potentially connected to this woman, and to try to finally identify who she was once and for all. Gunther immediately said he would do it, and he got to work. Right away, Gunther organized a task force to investigate this woman without a face. The task force was based in Heilbronn, but at Gunther's command, detectives on the team began reinvestigating all these crimes from all over Germany that this woman was involved in. They searched for patterns, for evidence, or witnesses that maybe had been missed during the original investigation. And through this effort, this team was able to come up with a very rough idea of who this woman was. They knew that she was very likely a heroin user because police had once recovered a heroin needle with her DNA on it at a public park. They also knew she had a lot of criminal contacts because many of her crimes involved co-conspirators. But anytime police had interrogated her co-conspirators, they had refused to say anything about her. It was like they were afraid of her. And there were a couple of other details that struck Gunther as being pretty odd. The only evidence this woman had ever left behind at any of these crime scenes was her DNA. And they didn't have a match in the database to pair it with, so they only knew she was a woman, but they didn't know who she was. In 14 years, she'd never left behind a fingerprint, a footprint, a hair, or anything else. So it seemed like, her crimes were extremely deliberate, very clean, very well planned, but also she was clearly leaving behind her DNA at all these crime scenes. It almost seemed like that was her calling card. Also, what Gunther and his task force discovered is that in many of the crimes committed by the woman without a face, witnesses described seeing what looked like a man at the scene, not a woman. And this was obviously weird because based on the DNA evidence, they knew unequivocally that their suspect, this woman without a face, was biologically female, not male. And so to Gunther, it seemed like, maybe this man that was being seen at these crime scenes was just one of the woman's co-conspirators, or maybe the woman without a face dressed as a man to avoid being caught. But it was impossible to know without a first-hand witness who had actually seen the suspect up close. That was what Gunther really needed. And in late May, about a month after the shooting in Heilbronn, Gunther got a call about that exact type of witness that he was looking for. That same day, Gunther walked into a hospital in Heilbronn, and he saw Heilbronn police officer Martin Arnold laying in a hospital bed with his eyes open. He'd been in a coma for a month now after being shot, but he had woken up. And he clearly was Gunther's best chance of catching the woman without a face, because presumably before he was shot, he might have gotten a look at her. So he was that witness who might be able to describe her. And so Gunther, he walked over, sat down next to Martin's hospital bed, and he asked him to please tell him everything he remembered about what happened. And Martin, he was very distraught about the whole thing. He's just woken up. He's just learned that his partner has died. And so he's very emotional. But he ultimately tells Gunther that, realistically, he can't really remember what happened. He basically turned around. He saw there was, these 2 figures. But after he got shot, it was like he just didn't remember anything. And so realistically, Martin had almost nothing to offer, which meant Gunther was back to square one. For the next 2 years, Gunther and his task force worked tirelessly to try to catch the woman without a face. They spent millions of euros, clocked thousands of hours of overtime, and even offered a reward equivalent to 400,000 US dollars for information. But none of it led anywhere. And adding insult to injury was the fact that the whole time this investigation is going on, the woman without a face kept committing crimes. The task force connected her to at least 6 more break-ins, 1 more robbery, and another murder. And these crimes weren't even just happening in Germany anymore. They also found the woman's DNA at crime scenes in France and in Austria. So now the entire region was on alert for this woman who seemed like this impossibly cunning international criminal genius. And Gunter, he couldn't help but start to wonder if he would ever be able to catch her. But then, in March of 2009, Gunter got a call from a police officer in France. And what this officer told him would change everything. According to this officer, the French police were currently investigating a potential murder. They told Gunter that a badly burned body had been found in France, and it was so disfigured that for a while, all police knew was that it was a man. However, an asylum seeker who had come to France had recently been reported missing, and police wondered if maybe the body belonged to him. So, on hunch, they had gotten his asylum application paperwork, which included his fingerprints, and they'd been able to lift a DNA profile from those prints. But when they had the DNA analyzed, the results didn't make any sense. And the French police were so baffled by these results that they were now calling Gunter because they knew if there's someone who needs to know about this, it's Gunter. And so Gunter, after being fully filled in about the baffling results that they had found, he was also at first very confused, but at the same time, he felt this new surge of hope. Because to him, it felt like, as bizarre as this was, maybe this was the break he'd been looking for the past 2 years. Maybe this was the time he was finally going to figure out who this woman really was. So he thanked the French police officer and then brought this new information to his team. And within just a few days, this new information from France did lead Gunter and his team to the woman with no face. It would turn out this woman, the international criminal mastermind behind dozens of crimes, including at least 4 murders, who had evaded capture for 16 years all across the entirety of Germany and beyond, appeared to everybody who actually knew her as a totally normal person. Like nobody suspected she was actually responsible for all these horrible crimes. She was a young woman who lived in southern Germany, who during the day she appeared to work at a factory, and at night she appeared to just go home. Like she lived a very ordinary life. And so again, nobody ever suspected her. But what the French police found when they analyzed the DNA from the missing man's asylum application was that that man's fingerprints somehow contained this woman's DNA. This was clearly impossible. Primarily because the man was biologically male and the woman without a face was biologically female. They knew that. So even if the asylum seeker had secretly been this woman, that wasn't really possible. And so when the French police saw this, they knew they had to tell Gunter because he was in charge of the woman without a face investigation. And when he and his team looked into this, they figured out something shocking. It was precisely this woman's normal-seeming life, in particular, her very normal-seeming job at the factory, that made everything she did possible. Because at this factory, this woman sat on an assembly line, helping to manufacture the very cotton swabs that police use in DNA testing. On any given single shift, this woman would touch hundreds or even thousands of these swabs and would accidentally leave her DNA behind on each one. There was no international serial killer, woman criminal mastermind parading around the whole country. No, there was just a lot of contaminated cotton swabs. And so in essence, police had wasted all this time, nearly 2 decades, millions and millions of euros, and thousands of hours of overtime, chasing a criminal who didn't exist. It was later determined that the police officer Martin Arnold and his partner Michelle were shot by 2 members of a neo-Nazi group. However, many of the other murders previously attributed to the woman without a face are still unsolved, primarily because police spent so long chasing the wrong suspect. Today, the case of the woman without a face is considered one of the biggest embarrassments in German police history. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. On the afternoon of May 2nd, 1930, a middle-aged woman named Kim Soo-jin walked into her farmhouse in a small village called Bibongmyeon in what is now South Korea. She had spent the whole day working outside on her farm, and now all she wanted to do was grab some water, sit down, and finally just rest for a second. But before she could do any of that, she heard a knock at her door. And even though she was exhausted, the sound of this knock actually sort of energized her because she was pretty sure that her 16-year-old son, Bak Chung-soo, had finally come home. So Soo-jin and her son ran this farm together, just the two of them. And they really barely made any money doing it. In fact, a lot of the time, they didn't even grow enough food to feed themselves. So, to try to make ends meet, Soo-jin's son had recently started a full-time job at an inn in town, and he also frequently did odd jobs in the village for extra cash. The problem was, Soo-jin's son would sometimes go straight from his job at the inn to one of those odd jobs, and he didn't always have time to stop by to tell his mother where he was going first. And remember, this was 1930 in rural Korea, so it wasn't like he could just call her. And so basically, this mother was left to worry about her son kind of frequently. And over the past 6 days, that is all Soo-jin did, because she had not seen or heard from her son at all. And even though he did go, days at a time in the past, doing these different odd jobs, this stretch was a pretty long time for him to be gone. But she told herself what must have happened is he must have found work with a family who was, having him work and live with them full time. Like this was just a great opportunity and he had taken it, and surely he would be home soon. And now it seemed like maybe, just maybe, he was home. So Soo-jin, she rushed to the front door, she opened it up, and the smile on her face faded immediately because it was not her son standing at the door. Instead, it was two police officers. And the first thing they asked her was if she knew of any teenage boys who were missing from the village. And Soo-jin told them that, she had a son of her own who was a teenager. He was 16. And the reality is she didn't know where he was, and he'd been gone for the past week. But don't worry, he wasn't missing. He was very likely just working for a family somewhere, and he'd be home soon. But after she said this, the police looked at Soo-jin with clear pity on their faces and told her they were so sorry, but they were nearly certain that her son had been murdered. Soo-jin just stared at them in shock and disbelief as they told her that a few days ago, during the time her son was gone, a teenage boy's body had been found on a nearby mountain. An autopsy showed he'd been beaten and strangled to death. And for the last couple of days, the police had been traveling all over the village, interviewing people and trying to figure out who this boy was. And based on everything they learned so far, Soo-jin's son was actually the only teenager in the area who wasn't accounted for. But hearing all of this, Soo-jin did not think this could be true. Her son stayed out of trouble and worked really hard. She couldn't imagine why anybody would want to hurt him. So she just told the police, this has got to be a mistake. But the police didn't seem to think so. They just said that they needed her to come to the local hospital morgue to identify the body. A little while later, Soo-jin arrived at the hospital with the two police officers. And as they led her through the entrance, down a few hallways, and towards the morgue, she kept telling herself that her son was okay. He was still alive, and this really has to be some sort of horrible mistake. It has to be. But the second she actually walked into the morgue and saw the body lying on the table, her eyes welled up with tears because she knew it was her son. And to Soo-jin, this moment felt like leaving real life and entering a nightmare. Her son's face and body were covered in bruises and wounds, and he was very clearly decomposing. I mean, it was just awful to see. But as this mother is sort of just staring down at basically a parent's worst nightmare here, she noticed something strange. She turned to the police officers and she told them that this was her son, definitely. But the clothes he was wearing were actually not his. And for some reason, to Soo-jin, the clothes thing felt very important. So she started rattling off ideas for, where they could have come from. It was like her brain suddenly became fixated on this one aspect to avoid touching on the trauma of losing her son. She began telling them that, maybe the family he was working for let him borrow them, or maybe he bought them without her knowing, or maybe whoever killed him dressed him up for some reason. But when she said that last part, it was like all at once, the reality of her son being dead just came crashing down on her. She started shaking, and before she knew it, she had collapsed onto the floor and was sobbing hysterically. Less than a week later, Soo-jin was sitting in her farmhouse, staring out her front window in a daze, when she saw the police walking towards her house again. Over the past few days, she hadn't heard any updates about her son's case, so she'd just been at the farmhouse all alone, trying to make sense of his death. But now, Soo-jin sees these officers, and so she goes right outside and she meets them and she asks them, do you have news for me about what happened to my son? And they tell her that she was likely going to have to sit down to hear this. Soo-jin figured it couldn't be worse than finding out your son's been murdered, so she said, okay, let's go inside. And so they went inside the farmhouse, they sat down, and then the police told her that they figured out who had killed her son. They told her they had not one, but two people in jail right now who had both issued full confessions. Both of these suspects were people that Soo-jin's son, Chung-soo, had worked with at the inn in town. One of them was a young man and one was a young woman. And apparently, Chung-soo had gotten involved in the woman's personal life. She was having an affair with a married man, but was planning to run away with a different man from the village soon. And Chung-soo had told the married man about it. When the woman found out that Chung-soo had done that, she was furious, so furious that she conspired with her coworker, the young man, the other suspect, to lure Chung-soo out to the mountains under the guise of gathering wild vegetables. And then when they got there, the man and the woman beat up Chung-soo and then strangled him to death. This had all happened on the first night that Chung-soo had left the farmhouse. So over that 6-day period, he pretty much went out and immediately was killed. And so over those 6 days, he was never, living with a family and working for them. He was just dead on the mountain the whole time. The police told Soo-jin that they had charged both suspects with murder. But after hearing all this, Soo-jin still had one question. What about her son's clothes? Was there anything in the suspect's confessions about that? But the police just shook their heads, no, and said the clothes didn't really seem relevant to the case anyway. And this time, even though Soo-jin, did feel like the clothes have to mean something, she didn't argue, or even, try to come up with other theories about the clothes. She just sort of accepted what the police had told her. As horrible as it was to know that her son was murdered over something so petty, she was at least glad to know that his killers were behind bars. Soo-jin eventually got her son's body from the police, and she was able to bury him in the local cemetery. And then after that, she did her best to try to move on, but she never could. And as this nightmare kept happening night after night, Soo-jin slowly became convinced that her son was haunting her dreams. And so Soo-jin basically stopped sleeping, couldn't really eat, certainly couldn't work. Her farm fell into disrepair. She actually began to think she was just gonna wither away and die here unless something changed. I mean, this was horrible. She was overcome with grief and sadness and also just scared. These dreams were terrifying. But then on the night of October 18th, 1931, so about 6 months after her son was killed, Soo-jin woke up from yet another nightmare. When she opened her eyes, she saw this shadowy figure at the foot of her bed, and she immediately realized that it was her son's ghost coming to visit her. But Soo-jin, she wasn't scared. She actually felt tears welling up in her eyes, and she actually just began speaking. She told the ghost, "I love you, but you have to move on. You have to rest in peace now. You have to." Now, Soo-jin really didn't know what she expected to happen here when she began speaking to the ghost. But what did happen was definitely not something she would have considered, because suddenly the ghost opened their mouth and they spoke. And what the ghost said changed everything. It would turn out Chung-soo, Soo-jin's son, had been viciously attacked by that man and woman up on the mountain. They really had beaten and strangled him and left him for dead. But he didn't die. He survived the attack. And when he came to, he fled the area because he was fearful if he went back home, they would finish the job. They would attack him and kill him. So he didn't have a chance to tell his mom that he was basically on the run. And so for 6 months, he's living in random towns, doing odd jobs to survive. But eventually, 6 months in, he misses his mom, he misses home, and he goes back and he walks into a room in the middle of the night. He is the ghost. And when she said to him, "You need to rest in peace now," he just says to his mom, "I'm not dead." And he was just being honest. "I'm here, I'm back, I survived." It would turn out the body that was found on the mountain was just some other teenage boy who was never identified, by the way, who happened to be in the same area where he had been attacked. And so when word got out about this body being found on the mountain, the man and the woman who had attacked Chung Soo, they're like, "Shoot, that's him, that was us." And they confessed to killing him because that's what they tried to do. They tried to kill him. They didn't kill him. It was some other body. And then when Soo Jin went to the morgue and saw this body, it was decomposing and he basically looked like her son. And so she misidentified him. She thought it was her son, but it really wasn't. And she fixated on his clothes and she was like, "Something's off." Well, she was right. It wasn't her son. It was someone else's clothes. And so in the end, the man and woman who had attacked Chung Soo had their murder charges dropped because they didn't commit a murder. And they were both ultimately released from jail after serving about a year in prison for the assault. As for the actual person who was found dead on the mountain, they were never identified and they were buried in a sort of unmarked grave. And the location of that grave has been lost to time. And so even though we have the ability today to test for DNA, we're not able to exhume them because we don't know where their grave is. And so very likely we'll never know who that person was.